Hi ma'am, so here's my code for lab 0. So first I wrote here an include code here as suggested by the author of the book in order to use his routines. Then for the first segment, which is the dot data, I defined here some bytes which contains some messages that shows up in the program, and then here are some zeros here for the null terminator. Then I just placed in some name labels so that I could reference these later in the code. Next, for the .bss segment, I just wrote some codes here that allocates space in the memory. Here it is where the memory spaces for the variables foo and bar are created. The rest D here reserves 4 bytes of memory for foo and bar. Then over here, I got the .text segment where majority of the coding happens. Here is where the global sets the ASM underscore main as where the code starts. Then over here, the enter 00 and push A are some suggested setup codes that I read from the author, so I just placed it here. Then over here, the data from message1 label that was defined earlier was moved to the EAX register to be used later as printing. Then the print string label was called, which is from the suggested routine from the author, where it prints the message1, which is the enter value of foo. And then the read int label was called under the author's routine, which just takes in the input from the user. Then during this routine, the input is actually stored in the EAX register, and now the value is moved to the foo label address. Now over here, same processes happen as what I explained earlier in this part, but this time it just prints out the enter value of bar. Then over here, similar processes take place regarding printing, but this time it just displays and print out what the value of foo is. And this time I just printed a new line here by moving the value of 10 to the EAX register. And then I just used the call for print car that is used from the author's routine. Then over here, same thing happens, but the bar variable is being printed. Then over here, the same thing happens, but this time it just prints out the after swapping message. Then for these parts, these lines of code over here is just the main gist of my lab exercise, where I just used the 8-bit registers under the 32-bit EDX register. Here the value in the foo label address is moved in the 8-bit DH register to temporarily store the value and be used later on for swapping. A similar thing happens here where I have to store the value in the bar label address and moved it in the DL 8-bit register. Now when the values are already stored, I just changed or swapped here the values. The DL register stores the bar variable value, and then since it stores the bar value, I just placed or moved the DL value to foo. And similar thing happens here where DH stores here the foo value, and then I just store the DH to the bar label address. Then after the swapping, the codes here are just similar to what I explained earlier about the print processes. it just prints out the value for foo and bar. And then lastly, for the very last parts, here are just some codes or routines that is suggested from the book's author in order to exit the code. And that's just all for my lab 0.